My mother is absolutely sure I'm going to solve climate change. And when it's hot, she actually calls me and she asks me, Yehuda? Say yes, everything is good. Say yes, everything is good. But it's so hot outside. So she's actually sure
Why
I'm
haven't you
solving
fixed
it
it
right
yet?
now.
Yeah,
Yes,
Yehuda,
I have
why
to
haven't you
fix it
fixed it
now.
yet? I'm Mr. Delavan. Welcome back to Wicked Problems.
If you didn't solve the energy problem, don't even bother scale it up. But if you solve the energy problem, now we need to scale in numbers. And we did it in batteries. Humanity knows how to do it. We did it in solar. Okay, humanity knows how to manufacture flat things in high volumes.
So in this episode, we're back talking about one of our favorite topics, carbon dioxide removals, CDR. Yeah, we are a bit like that. And it's second only to geoengineering in really having an ability to rile people up in climate circles. It's too expensive. It uses too much energy. There just aren't enough buyers. Microsoft still makes up a ridiculously high proportion of the entire market of people purchasing credits from companies working in the space. And the technology has been embraced by oil companies like Occidental Petroleum, and therefore that makes it morally suspect. Because, and not irrationally, people do worry that this is going to provide an excuse for people to keep emitting and business as usual, as opposed to having to make some of the hard but probably very unpopular choices that rely on the alternatives about how you can actually reduce emissions. And of course, it is a bit of a Wild West kind of vibe in some parts of the market, which means that there are companies like Running Tide this year that actually went out of business with some questions to answer about the kind of the ways that they were doing things and how they were actually verifying and measuring and reporting on some of the things that they were actually getting up to and selling credits for. So there's that. To make any of the climate models, to try to get to net zero work at any point, some amount of actually taking carbon out of the air is going to be necessary to make those models pencil out. That's just the math. So if it doesn't work, that's going to be a problem. The question is going to be how much, what's feasible, and how much is it going to cost, and what technologies are going to be more effective or most cost effective than others. People increasingly talk about overshoot, right? This idea that you're going to go past 1.5, but we should keep the target because if we don't, that's bad. We'll say we'll overshoot, but we'll figure it out. Okay, fine. How? And what does that actually look like? And what's going to happen in the meantime? Which is why, as we end this particular trip around the sun and to get ready to start a new one, we wanted to bring together what we think are the key technology areas that are going to be important for that conversation as we go forward. One is adaptation. One is CDR. One is geoengineering or solar radiation management, which is definitely going to be something we're talking about. Because if you think Elon Musk isn't going to be starting to talk about that pretty soon, you are mistaken. Another area, of course, is going to be climate risk, and particularly on the data side, because as we're seeing increasingly covered in the media, try getting a home insurance policy somewhere next to the Gila forest in New Mexico, which now has, 1 out of every 10 policies being canceled or not renewed because of wildfire risk. Just one example, you can look at map of places around the United States and increasingly here in the UK and other places where getting insurance against things like floods, things like fires is just becoming either unaffordable or impossible. At least with the climate risk data, that at least should allow the pricing of risk to at least be more rational. And that might lead to different decisions when it comes to whether or not to issue policies, how much they're going to cost, or indeed, ultimately, what places are not going to be viable. That is going to be a very, very difficult conversation indeed. So, that's a cheery one. Nice. And that's why another conversation coming up with Tina Morris from Flint Pro to talk about some of those new data tools and how that's reshaping some of those conversations. But we also wanted to talk to a stubborn optimist in CDR, and Yehuda Borenstein, as somebody who's built or is building multiple climate tech companies across different domains, is nothing if not a stubborn optimist. Starting one business is tough enough. Starting multiple ones at the same time sounds like you probably have a high pain threshold, pretty thick skin, and as they say in Ireland, a neck like a jockey's bollocks. Look it up. His CDR company, RepAir, says it's solved, or at least made a lot of progress, in addressing the challenges that have so far made things like direct air capture a bit pricey. According to CDR.FYI, the spot price this morning for a ton of DAC removal was $470, which is a lot higher than the $100 a ton that a lot of observers say is the kind of holy grail, where you can actually start to think about how to scale that technology to actually start removing not just thousands or even millions, but the billions of tons of CO2 removal that is going to be necessary by 2050 if we have any shot at keeping some of those models viable. Quick side note, I see a Freya Pratty in this morning's climate tech newsletter from Sifted is leading with the debate about whether the term climate tech is dead. Well, for the record, we're sticking with it. So I guess that makes us a stubborn optimist as well, but also why we think that the term itself and what it means has been changing. And that's why we're bundling these areas together: adaptation, CDR, SRM, the grid, climate risk data. That's where we think the action is going to be in 2025, or where the conversation should be centered. And we're nearly at peak gift giving time. So if you're enjoying these conversations, please do like, rate, and review on a platform of your choice. And a subscription at wickedproblems.earth makes a fantastic holiday gift, especially if you think that over the next few years, we really are going to need independent media that's going to help cover these things without fear or favor, which is what we try to do here, because we're just a bit like that. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Yehuda.
Yehuda Borenstein, serial climate venture builder and chairman and co-founder of RepAir. Thank you for coming on Wicked Problems.
Thank you, Richard. It's my pleasure to be here.
We met in Munich at a conference not so long ago, earlier this year, on adaptation, about a completely different company from RepAir. And we were just talking in the green room about, you are kind of a climate tech renaissance man. In a sense, you're in so many different kind of subsectors. And give us an idea about how have you, why are you involved in so many of these ventures? And tell us about a couple of them before we come back to DAC and RepAir.
Sure. So I always wanted to be an investor or involved in something like a VC when I look at many things at the same time. I think my personal strength is to take something from -1 into 1. So I love things that you don't have anything, just maybe a paper from a professor in the university, and I can take it from the paper and build a team of 10 people, start doing something to commercialize it, and then I get bored. I don't like it too much. Too many people, the daily stuff. So what's the right job for a person that likes to take something from -1 to a 1 and then needs to be replaced? So I thought that this is the ideal solution for me, to scout for technologies in something very important like climate, build the companies, build the teams, answer most of the issues early stage companies has by the way that I'm structuring it. Mm-hmm. And then let someone else to do the hard work from 1 to 100 that I don't know how to do. So I found the perfect fit for me, for my personality. I know it's uncommon. Many people, when they look at what I'm doing, they say, okay, what's wrong with you? But it works good for me, and I'm very happy with what I'm doing.
You can tell you're always full of energy and spark whenever I talk to you, and it's just great to see. You're like a one-man VC. You have like a whole portfolio of companies that you've kind of helped get off the ground, exactly. Like you say, -1 to 1. So let's talk about direct air capture, DAC. So RepAir is one of the things we want to talk about today. You're the co-founder of that. What made you decide to get involved in direct air capture. We'll just call it DAC for short for the rest of this conversation for brevity.
Sure,
So why DAC?
sure. So uh, when I looked for technologies, I thought that carbon capture in general, and not necessarily just DAC, is could be a key to decarbonize. And I came across a very interesting technology that, from the first look, I realized that is going to change the game. And there were some challenges, and we were able to solve them. It wasn't that simple. But I realized that in the technology that I reviewed, there is a lot of promise. Um, to be 100% honest, I was not 100% clear about DAC, about all the small details, but it sounds fantastic to capture CO2 from the air. If I can do it with minimum amount of energy, wow, that's something big. When I got more deeper, I really understood that we have something very unique.
And we want to come back to a couple of the points that you raised there, particularly about the energy requirements and what you guys are doing about that, because that seems to be RepAir's kind of big claim to fame. But I mean, like in terms of your background before becoming this kind of renaissance guy in climate tech, venture building, um, your background in defense and automotive. I mean, how has that influenced your thinking? When you first decided, like, yeah, I can apply some of the insights, some of the things that I've learned from some of these other sectors to the sector that we're going to explore getting involved in with RepAir.
Sure. So my strength also in the previous work was mainly in system engineering. I don't know chemistry. I don't know how to design an electronic board. So all my life I was always positioned from a technical point of view at the system engineering level. And I think this is something that helped me a lot in climate, because that's probably the part that is missing when you look at about how to solve the climate problem is the system engineering. And climate is a system of systems. And I think this is key when we are evaluating every solution, not to just see that it works, but also how it affects the whole system. And I think this is where my previous work helped me a lot to look at things from a system point of view.
And with RepAir itself, I mean, we want to come to some of the details in a moment, but like, what were some of the biggest things you had to overcome in terms of getting started? I mean, I suppose there's already some pretty established players. I mean, I would imagine we're going to start even to see some consolidation in the space because we've got your Climeworkses, we've got your Heirlooms, and Oxy actually has already done some consolidation in terms of picking up 1.5, which I guess previously was Carbon Engineering. So and there's others that have been out there. So, what made you decide that there was space in the market for something different? And, what things did you have to overcome to get started?
Sure. So just I'm now going back 4 years to the beginning of the corona, a little bit after it started. And uh, I'm a good friend of the professor that started the technology. And I just sent him an article about something else. And he told me, look, I have something very interesting for you. And I started to speak with people. Nobody were traveling at this time.
Mm.
Most of the people in Israel didn't know what I'm talking about. Carbon capture? You want to find carbon capture from the air? It doesn't make sense. Those three, let's say, pioneers, Climeworks, carbon engineering, and there was global thermostat. People told me, oh, those are crazy guys. Just don't get there. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So I had to overcome it and really get into the details and to understand, because people, the first reaction is that just it doesn't make sense. Just leave it alone. Do something more practical. And at that time, I was really looking for. I wanted to find a technology in creating hydrogen, because I wanted to be like an oil company. I want to be an
Right.
oil person, but without the CO2. So let's make green hydrogen. And I was looking for a technology that is different in green
Mm.
hydrogen, but unfortunately, I couldn't find anything. Now I'm fortunate, because I think that what we have is much more valuable than making green hydrogen. But at that time, really convincing people that it makes sense and you have no way to travel, that was a really big challenge. But we managed. We raised like $1.2 million and started the company. And then 2021 came, and it was just great because people had money to invest, and the rest is history.
And you've got some projects underway. I want to come back to those in a minute, but let's talk about the tech itself. And again, I know you're not the guy inventing the tech. You've explained that and disclaimed very clearly you're not a chemist. But the way that the company presents its solution, relies very much on a unique approach. Different from a lot of the other kind of direct air capture methodologies that you hear a lot about. So, I mean, in
Sure.
layman's terms, for bear of small brain here, if you could explain like the different, what is exactly the solution and the technology, how does it actually work? It seems like it was grounded in battery technology somehow.
Yes, it's a mix between a battery and a fuel cell in terms of structure and materials that we are using. And we only need electricity. So that's kind of the first thing that is very important. It's electrochemical cell, and we only need electricity. That gives us a huge advantage, when you want to use renewables or you want to use the grid or any other device. We only need electricity, and there is no other consumables. The second very important thing is we use solid materials. Okay, one of the challenges direct air capture has when it comes to having air running into a liquid, you really need a big surface area in order to capture the CO2. We're using solid materials. The surface area is much less of an issue. We can design it in a way that you get, like, let's say, active carbon, and you have a large surface area in the electrode. So it's much more efficient and require much less energy. Most of the energy is not necessarily in the chemical reaction when the CO2 is bonded to the media that uh, is attached to. The
Right.
energy goes to the fans, the energy goes for pressure drop in the channels, then it goes to the mechanical, and most of it usually go into the release mechanism. So when you look at all of it, if you are capturing the CO2 in the way that we are doing in a solid material, you are saving a lot of energy compared to the other systems. Okay? Now, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was
Want
just
to
going to
go
ask you
first?
to, like, yeah, how much energy? Because I mean, like the big claim, which I saw you put out on LinkedIn yesterday, very pithy, is essentially that for 1 megawatt hour of electricity, first generation DAC could kind of capture about 400 kilograms of CO2, and you're
Yeah.
saying that the rep air methodology uses 70% less energy, so you can get 1,200 kilograms for the same unit of electricity input. So, and people are just going to say that just sounds too good to be true. So, like, just explain to me why I should believe that. I mean, you've already done something in terms of that, but, like, are you getting pushback from other people when you make this claim? How do they react, and what do you say?
Well, less and less, less and less. The first good thing is you can come to see it. It's like, it's not that I'm claiming it and there is no working hardware. There is a working hardware. You can come and see it, and there is no question if you believe it or not. You can come, you can measure, you can do whatever you want. You can look at them at the chemistry, the equations, whatever is needed, and it's working. So here you can decide not to believe it, but it's working. I have no,
Fair enough.
no,
And
I
again,
think the best thing.
yeah, and I guess, I mean, there are some. It just, I suppose it's such a one of the things that critics have always talked about with the both people generally like yourself initially look at carbon capture or direct air capture as being like, wow, we have this big challenge, right? To 2050, we've built into our assumptions that in order to get to a net zero state, in terms of emissions, we are going to have to do the gigaton scale of removal of carbon. But then when you start to do the maths, they get scary very quickly about how much electricity that's going to require, how much other process that's going to require, how much kit building stuff is going to require that. And so I suppose that the getting a dramatic decrease in energy consumption to actually take the process through is actually like really big story. um, I guess the other thing that you guys talk about is the scalability, right? So it's the way you're approaching the actual design, in addition to the materials, is that you're designing from the beginning, from about how to make sure everything's modular. So, tell me more about that as well.
Sure. So I want to take a little bit backwards to talk about
Yeah.
a little bit more about the energy, because I think this is probably the biggest difference and the most important parameter. And let me tell you why. So the first generation carbon capture technologies, they need about 2.5 megawatt hour in order to capture a ton of CO2. Okay. If you look at the US grid will emit 400 kilograms of CO2 for every 1 megawatt hour that it generates.
Mm,
So if you need 2.5, you will actually going to emit more than you capture or be at zero balance.
mm,
And most of the criticism that is coming from people that look at the system level is justified when that's the number. Okay. And they say, no, you don't use the grid. We will use renewable. Okay. So, but if I have renewable, why shouldn't I use the renewable for just replacing something on the grid and to instead of direct air capture?
mm,
So that's the most important parameter. If you have a DAC system that requires more than 1 megawatt hour overall from the capture, the release, the storage, question yourself if you want to go forward with the project, because it doesn't really make sense. The other thing is, only if you have a very low energy intensity and also materials can be in a low price, there is no reason to scale it up. Nobody will give you money to scale something up that requires more energy than just replacing something on the grid. Okay, it just doesn't work. There are a lot of demos and there are a lot of nice things, some niche markets, great. But to really get into the gigaton level, you need the 600, the 500 kilowatt hour. Otherwise, it will never make sense to scale it up. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, when we approach the scale up, it's very hard to scale up every time, every project from the beginning. What I like Tesla approach. Okay, in many ways, I like what Tesla is doing. They took a small battery. Instead of reinventing the batteries, they took a small battery and they duplicated, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 batteries.
yeah.
And now you have an 80 kilowatt hour battery that can drive a car. Now, in our case, it is not going to be a small battery. It's going to be a big carbon capture battery. Okay, it's going to be like half a meter by half a meter on 1 meter. That's going to be our carbon capture battery. We call it Stack Duck.
Mm.
We are going to release it next year. And that's going to be the building block that we will scale in numbers, not in scale up for us. A project of 1 million, a project of 100 million will look the same. We'll always have the same basic unit. And this is the only way that you can scale it up. And manufacturing is the biggest problem that you have after you solve the energy problem. So if you didn't solve the energy problem, don't even bother scale it up. But if you solve the energy problem, now we need to scale in numbers. And we did it in batteries. Humanity knows how to do it. We did it in solar. Okay, humanity knows how to manufacture flat things in high volumes.
And I think that, I mean, for me, like when we talked a little bit about your background in automotive and some defense sectors, the thing that again, we talked in the green about Michael Barnard. He's been on the show. We're fans, but I do think that like I'd like to have a more productive discussion with him when I'm smarter on the topic about DIC, of which he is one of the most articulate skeptics. Let's just say, and I think you've countered some of the things that he's talked about. So I want to come back to some of those things, but I also want to talk about cost, right? Because again, if we did the back of the envelope calculations, right? In terms of, you've talked about levelized costs as low as $50 per ton of CO2 captured using
Mhm.
this process. Again, that's presumably partly the modular scalability of exactly the design approach, but also the energy use, being reduced. So, and I think $200 is like like the over under for competitors. $100 a ton is like the holy grail in the U.S. Department of Energy's kind of, and X Prize and other places that are trying to shoot for that. But the market price currently, looking at CDR.FYI, is like 488 a ton. Some of the contracts are being written for, some of them are being written for 100, but no one believes it. They just know that this is a nice thing to shoot for, but like in terms of the things actually being yielded, Climeworks has said that their numbers have actually gone up in terms of their per ton cost, for capture. So first of all, like $50 a ton, right? What's leaving out from that? What is missing from that number? Is it, in terms of disposal, storage, mineralization, transport, like what's not in the $50? Because that seems really low.
Okay, so first, the number also include storage. Okay, it's storage at high volume. This will cost around $10 in cell and aquifers.
Hmm.
The thing it doesn't cost, it doesn't include is our profit. We will probably not sell it for $50. We will sell it
Right.
for 70, 80.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are talking about cost and not the price to the end customer.
Fair.
And we hope that the more we decarbonize, actually the carbon credits price will go up. Obviously not up from 1,000. The prices today are not prices for the product. Companies are paying for direct air capture those high prices because they understand it's important to push this market forward, to show that it can be done from a technical point of view and allow it the starting point so we can do price reduction. Okay. Now, with the technologies that you have today, the price reduction is limited. You probably will be very hard to go below $200.
Right.
Okay. With our technology, obviously the price now is not $50 per ton, but we can show how we can go down to $50 per ton with scale, with manufacturing, and the way that we can prove it is divided to two. First is the OPEX, which is the majority is the energy. And since we are at 600 kilowatt hour, you can imagine that if the cost of electricity is 3 cents per kilowatt hour, which is a reasonable cost that we already have today with solar, it's not there for other energies, but in solar we are close to 3 cents for kilowatt hour. We're talking about $18.
Hmm.
So $18 is about half of the, let's say half of the price. And then you have the capex. There are two things very important about the capex. And the most important one is longevity. We are aiming to 15, 20 years lifetime. And this is why we are working in very low currents. And that also allows us very good efficiency. The higher the current, the lower the efficiency. And then you have a lot of waste. You have a lot of waste. You need energy to add to the cost. So we
And heat.
choose and heat the operating point, then we are most efficient. We don't need a lot of energy. And the capex will live for 15, 20 years. Okay, the units will live for 15 to 20 years. And we did a lot in the capex, like we replaced the bipolar plates from metal to plastic. Nobody is using plastic bipolar plates. By moving to plastic, we reduced the price significantly, the weight. We did a lot of work to make it something that can be scalable and cost. And the materials that we are using are extremely simple. We are using membranes that are similar to desalination membranes. And we are not using any precious metals. So the capability to go down in price is significant.
Right.
Overall, when you look at very large volumes, $50 makes sense. And we can support it with the TEA and LCA and
Right. No, that makes.
it's not unreasonable.
No, and I think you've laid out again. You've answered, I would imagine, like some of the most common questions about like when I've heard people on, I don't know, Shell Khan on Canalist, or talking to listening to other folks on other smart people much smarter than me on some of these other podcasts. The number one, the smartest question I always hear someone ask is like, yeah, what's your assumption about the cost per kilowatt hour for the energy you're going to be able to achieve for your solution, whether it's in carbon capture or anything else? And then there's a bunch of other questions which I think you've addressed. So let's leave that there. Let's talk about the off takers and customers, because that's obviously a huge issue for everyone in climate tech. It was obviously a big topic in New York Climate Week, which you've just come back from. We get to the valley of death, right? The dreaded commercialization growth capital stage of having to get to scale some of these things. And usually where it falls down is like, who are the off takers? Who's going to be the customers for these things? So what are your ideal customers for RepAir?
So actually, in order to reduce risk, and also we have some nice tricks that if you like, I can tell you about them.
Sure.
We have
Yeah, go
some
for it.
very nice carbon tricks. Okay, carbon
I
tricks.
like it. Okay.
Uh,
Go for it.
we think that there is a problem with the market. It has to be regulated. If you want to go to the gigaton level, it has to be regulated. So I don't want to waste a lot of time on the market today.
Okay.
This is something when we need a regulation, like you don't throw your garbage in the middle of the living room or from the window. And CO2 in large scale, it's the same as garbage. And somebody needs to pay for it. Somebody needs to collect it. We can collect it in the lowest price. If there will be no regulation, it's easier to emit. It's better for the bottom line of every company. So there are good companies like Microsoft and others that really wants to push these things forward, and they are putting a voluntary market and credits and creating the market and pushing it and bringing awareness. But that's not a solution, and it's not a gigaton solution. So, and if humanity will not decide that she wants to solve climate change and pay for the carbon, we will continue. I have this is why I have an adaptation company. Okay, if you don't
Right.
do mitigation, I'm going to enjoy it in the adaptation, because climate will get worse. So we have to find a way to have a system that you pay for the emission of the carbon, and that's the first thing. The second thing, we are actually looking at our beachhead market in point source.
Hmm.
Okay, for aluminum smelters, they have a big problem.
Mm.
The current
Several.
technologies of carbon capture, they are too expensive because they have 1% CO2 in their flue gas.
Right.
And they don't really have a cost-effective solution. We did some testing for 1% point source, and we got 350 kilowatt hour. If you were skeptic about the 600, we got 350 kilowatt hour. It's with 1% CO2, and obviously the more concentrated the CO2 is, we need less energy to capture it. But this is something that we think will be even more economical, and there is pressure from the automotive industry to have low carbon footprint aluminum. And we think
Hmm.
it's a great beachhead market. There are 350 million ton a year emitted from aluminum smelters, and we have a unique solution. So this is where we will start. The market is known, the need is known, and if we can capture it for less than $50, boom, we have customers, we can start growing, and we can wait that the market will develop for direct air capture. Now,
Right.
about the carbon trick. Once there is a direct air capture, okay, let's assume that we have a huge facility of 1 gigaton for direct air capture. Why not taking point source flue gas and mix it on the gas level together with the direct air capture?
Mm-hmm.
Just to mix them. So now instead of 420 ppm, you will have 700, 800, 1000 ppm. You cannot go much higher because then it will be point source capture and not direct air capture. But let's assume you do 50-50. Okay, 50% of the gas is coming from the air, 50% coming from the point source. You don't do anything, just mixing the gases. Now you put it into the direct air capture machine that we call it now the enriched direct air capture.
Mm.
You don't add any additional hardware. So you can think about that there is no hardware for the point source.
Mm.
And the additional energy that you need to invest is the only thing that you need to invest is a little bit more energy. So when we did the calculation, we actually tested this combined enriched direct air capture. Instead of 600 kilowatt hour, we went down to 450 kilowatt hour because we had more CO2, the system were more efficient.
Right.
So now I can sell point source for less than $20 because there is no hardware.
Mm.
And the only thing you need is a little more energy.
And this is interesting. I've not heard this approach in terms of essentially co-location, right? So you're as opposed to building big industrial fans in the middle of Iceland or in somewhere in the prairies of Minnesota or North Dakota, you're talking about locating the kit in the same places you're going to capture some of this flue gas at point source in order to be able to do both, essentially. And that changes things in terms of where you have physical footprint, changes where your energies, kind of hookups might come from, et cetera. So that is interesting. I've not really seen that ever talked about before. And it's like you've got 3 partnerships already up and running, right? In terms of one in France, one in Kenya, and one in Greece. I think did I read somewhere that one of them is like this kind of a colo kind of model where you're doing something that's, or maybe I've got that wrong, but I just
No,
want to make sure I understand.
it's something that I started to communicate on LinkedIn some time ago. It's kind of a new approach. In any setup that we are doing, we can do it.
Yeah.
And it opens so many different alternatives. For example, we don't necessarily need to use solar or wind. It's preferred, but we don't necessarily need it. I can take a gas turbine and capture the CO2 from the gas turbine together. So I can have a gas turbine that will be net zero. Okay. It releases a lot of the stress that you have when you're making a duck project, that now I can use almost any source of energy. And then if you have industries around it, I can capture the flue gas from the other industries and help to clean those industries without adding any hardware. So it's hardware-less point source, but you have to have direct air capture for it. And this is why, in a way, what I'm trying to say, direct air capture as a standalone, it doesn't make sense. If you already build direct air capture, please give me all the garbage from the point source and let me capture it for the lowest cost possible.
Right.
Now, the other nice thing about it, because we're using electrochemistry and only electricity, whenever you have waste electricity, I can take it and I can capture more carbon with no hardware at a very low price. Now, I know that now a lot of people are talking about the negative prices of solar and wind, or mainly solar, because you have too much solar on the grid, and at some point in time, it's better to pay to somebody to consume it than actually stopping the activity. I think it's a market failure, yes. So you cannot build on it for the long run.
Right.
But because solar and wind are intermediate, there will always have this problem. And if we connect it with electrochemical direct air capture, you can help that in case that there is nobody to consume it, we can use every electron and make sure that this electron will capture a CO2. So that's another benefit that you have on a system level.
I want to come back at a couple things, right? One is on the energy piece, right? So again, zoom out, right? And I think you've made an interesting case about why it's not necessarily as clean as I'm about to lay it out. But using the maths, right, from rep air in terms of that process and the levelized costs that you're talking about, trying to achieve, not including profit, et cetera. But if, let's say, for example, right, so at the gigaton scale, so to do 1 billion, would require about 8,333 terawatt hours using your math in terms of capturing 1 billion tons of CO2, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's currently the electricity consumption of China in a year. So I think that you can draw your conclusions about like what would that mean in terms of kind of the electricity requirements that if you were to do that. And again, and you guys have a massive advantage. Like again, assuming those numbers hold up, and I have no reason to think they don't. But again, it's much worse if you guys aren't the only game in town, right? If other people are having to use a lot more electricity, it gets a lot worse than that. So multiple Chinas, right? Which seems bad, right? When you consider that what we're talking about is still, gosh, I mean that's like what data centers are projected to get to sometime in the late 2030s, early 2040s in terms of electricity consumption requirements. So that's when people talk about that's an insane additional load on the future grid or future electricity requirements. I guess that's what they're talking about. Now, the other thing is, again, if the IPCC is correct, and you need 10 billion, not 1 billion by 2050, right? At $50 a ton, that's $500 billion. That's the GDP of Israel, the GDP of the UAE, the GDP of Norway right now.
Yes.
That just seems like a lot.
Well, first, it's in line. The numbers are correct. Okay, so let's start from the consensus. The numbers are correct.
Okay.
You cannot do decarbonization for $1. And not for 100 billion. It's going to be in the trillions and hundreds of trillions. That's what we will have to pay for decarbonization. Now, if you look only at the number of electricity, you are right, but the 10 gigaton of CO2 are emitted not just from electricity, from many other industries. Overall, humanity needs about 180,000 terawatt hour a year. So if you compare it not to electricity, but to the overall energy that we are consuming, it's much less.
So I was looking at the IEA numbers earlier as I was getting ready for this conversation. And so I think one of their scenarios looks at 66,000 terawatt hours by 2050. So just remind me with the 180 in terms of where that's coming from so that I'm getting my facts right.
Yeah, 180,000 is the electricity not electricity, the energy that we are using today.
Got it. The
for
primary
everything.
Energy. But it's primary
energy for everything, not just electricity. Yeah. But this is when you are cleaning 10 gigaton, you are not cleaning 10 gigaton of emitted from electricity. You are cleaning 10 gigaton that is emitted from the overall energy we are using.
Yeah. And I think you, me, Michael Barnard, and every other sensible person on the planet would be all in 100% agreement that maximizing electrification and squeezing out that ridiculous, whatever that name of the curve thing from the Lawrence Livermore labs they put out, that kind of graph showing 67% of all primary energy gets wasted because it's not as efficient as just if you electrify everything possible. So the math isn't. It's just bone crushingly stupid to do anything else as quickly as possible. So we all agree on that. So 100% got that. Cool. So now we're on the same page. So let's talk about. So okay, let's say I agree for the sake of argument. So your different pilot projects that you talk about on the website or the Rep talks about on the website, each has a different storage methodology that it talks about. Like one is saline aquifers, others talking about mineralization in I think Kenya, and then I can't remember if it's Greece or if the French example has a different, again, on-site storage, which I guess Rep is talking about building, which I guess is some other kind of mechanical storage for CO2 as opposed to salt caverns. So again, if storage costs are included in that thing, again, how much is the storage cost of a $50, right? So just so I'm trying to work out in my head what that's going to actually amount to.
Yeah. So first, the projects that we have right now are mainly demonstration projects. Okay, mm-hmm. So both us and the storage partner, we want to demonstrate feasibility, demonstrate what we are doing, not just at the carbon capture scale, but also together with storage. And that's the main purpose of those projects. From my point of view, if we are doing 1,000 ton or 10,000 ton, it's less important. What is important is that we demonstrate we can do it, it's working, and we can put it aside. Okay. Mm-hmm. The other part of it is to really show the economic of a single unit that we can duplicate like crazy, and we will have to duplicate it like crazy. If you ask me, storage is not the main problem. There are solutions already today, and storage is something that we need to manage. We need to build, there are enough wells, there are enough saline aquifers that we can put it underground. Still, there is some development needs to be done in mineralization. Conceptually, I think it's easier for us to understand if we stuck something into a stone, that's it, it's not going out. Okay, then putting it in the saline aquifer, that, oh, what will happen if there will be an earthquake, or there will be an earthquake? This is where gases are coming from originally,
Yeah.
so they will go out. But I'm trying to answer what my clients wants, and
Right.
I think the sentiment is better for mineralization. At least today, sentiment is better for mineralization, and if that's practical and if it can answer the need for $10 storage, why not?
I think, and again, I think it answers something else that Michael Byron and others bring up a lot, which is again is like the transport risks of CO2 and some of the already close calls that we've had in places like Mississippi, where there's been a major accident that resulted in a CO2 leakage, from a ship, a transport of concentrated CO2, which led to people feeling very ill, and then emergency vehicles not even be able to have, because they were industrial, because they are internal combustion engine vehicles, they didn't work with a high CO2 environment. So even the fire trucks couldn't get to the spot where the train wreck was, which seems bad and is scary and is I can see why that's going to take off as a narrative, which is turning into a rock. You don't need to explain it to anybody like why that's fine. And probably even a legislator or a regulator or people or a liability lawyer who might be thinking about like, how am I going to sue for these things? Your insurer might find it a little more comfortable. So like, let's leave this aside. But the final thing that everyone always comes back to this as a criticism of the industry is that, like, yeah, but surely all you're doing is providing an extension of the social license for people who tend to be the investors in this space, like Shell and Equinor, who I guess were like some of the big ones behind the A round for Rep Air. So, like, I ask this of everybody who comes on the show who works in the sector, so it's not meant to be any way a surprising question. How do you reconcile taking money from oil and gas if you're encountering people who are worried about the fact that like what you're doing, maybe in the long term it's fine, but in the short term you're helping the arguments of some of the worst people on earth about why they should continue to be able to do the things that they're doing?
So, first, I believe that we shouldn't look for enemies, we should look for allies. And I believe that the oil companies could be part of the solution. They have a lot to gain from it, so they will put the money and they will put the effort to make it happen. People that really care about decarbonization make sure that the right policies will be in place. Don't look at the oil companies. They will try to maximize their profit. As a shareholder, if I was a shareholder in an oil company, this is exactly what I would expect from them. Okay, so they're doing their job. If we are worried about climate, let's make sure that it will not be a political issue and we will put the right system in place so we can decarbonize. Okay, we should put the criticism to the oil companies aside because they can be part of the solution. Okay. Now, the other thing I always like to say to people, look at trees, for example. Everybody loves trees. Nobody will say, oh, let's cut all the trees. But trees capture CO2 and emit CO2 at the same time, but they capture more than they emit. And by the end, but when they die, they release all the CO2.
Right.
Okay. So if you're using trees, you have to put new trees in order to decarbonize because all trees, instead of a tree replacement, doesn't do anything. It's net
Right.
zero, but it doesn't really help to decarbonize because it's already there and it's already captured. So why not looking at our energy system the same way we're looking at trees? We can continue emitting, but we have to capture more than we emit. Okay, that's my philosophy. That's what I believe.
Yep.
We have to put the right system to capture more than we emit, and then actually we can clean the air. Not just, and I'm not trying to be romantic, I'm not trying to be idealistic. I want to be practical. We cannot live without fossil fuels today and in the next 50 years. So instead of going with our heads direct and be romantic, let's be practical, let's be pragmatic, let's find solutions.
A couple of last things I wanted to ask you about. One is just on New York Climate Week. Again, like I would be remiss not taking the opportunity. You've just come back. What was that like? Were you out pitching, in terms of like trying to raise for the next round for some of these companies that you're involved in? What was the mood like? And how was the conversation around CDR and DAC more broadly, if you were involved in those in New York, different this year than, what you've heard in the past?
So since I have a lot of hats, I was involved in many
Oh,
type
sure.
of events. Many type of events. One of the first event that I went to was actually from API. It's the oil and gas,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
more oil and gas related meeting. And what I saw there is that they have no plans to stop using oil. Okay,
No.
2050, 2070, and that's obvious. They have no plans, and I don't think anybody from the government has plans to ask them to stop. Okay, so the best we can do is to capture the shit that we are emitting, but they are very practical about capturing. So they look at capturing. They look at there is so much natural gas in the U.S. and they will not give up the huge resource that they have on the ground. They're going to use it. So the oil companies are looking how can they reduce the methane emissions, which is extremely important, even as the same as the CO2 emissions, how to do it. The good thing is it's the stuff you need to do in reduce the methane emissions is before you actually combust, not
Yeah.
after you combust. So there is a lot of activity there. And there is also a lot of activity to reduce the CO2. I believe that once we will present our solution and people will see the price point that we can get, things will change. Okay? If it will be $20 per ton to capture CO2 from the point source, we can decarbonize faster, we can put regulation around it faster. Once people will understand the solution is practical, we will pay in our pockets. Somebody will have to pay for it. But if the price is lower and the price will be at the right point, we can also make the right regulations. Because people will still want to have energy and to have food. You cannot run away from it.
Well, sometime we have to sit down and actually, you've given me more goss off air about going to an actual API event at Climate Week. I'm really intrigued. But in terms of other things about the vibe, anything else? Like, again, I don't know if you've been to New York Climate Week before or come cops, but what I've heard, some people criticize it for being sort of like toxic positivity. Was there a happy talk? And was the mood different this year from previous years, given some of the pretty dramatic news flow that seems to be climate related happening with massive parts of North Carolina and Tennessee and Georgia flattened by a historic storm. Other parts around the world, experiencing the Sahara, experiencing flooding, the Amazon experiencing drought. It seems like, pretty grim. So was New York kind of a bubble of like, well, we're not going to think about that right now?
Well, I think for me, Climate Week was meeting a lot of optimistic people. It's a lot of people that wants to do good. So even if
Of
there are
course.
bad things happening around, the atmosphere was great. I met a lot of investors in the field. I met a lot of people that are in similar areas. No, it was absolutely great. And the highlight of my Climate Week was meeting Bill Gates. I had the chance to pitch to Bill Gates what we are doing in Climate Crop. And for me, Bill Gates is probably the single person that is doing the most for climate in so many different ways. So for me, it was the highlight of the week, and it was a real, let's say, refreshment. And I got a lot of positive energy from the whole event. And I'm here to win. I'm here to win in the contents with all the others, and also to see if I can do something good.
That is as a hell of a thing to drop in at the end of the conversation, man. But okay, that's fine. I feel like I've been a little bit hard done by there. We'll have to get you on again to talk about Climate Crop, and we'll come back to that meeting. What you can say about it. And then finally, before we let you go, Yehuda, thank you so much, by the way, for taking the time to do this. We ask all particularly someone who's wearing so many hats as you are, I think a lot of listeners and will be interested to know the kinds of things that shaped your views. I mean, even like someone like Bill Gates has been pretty open about some things that shaped his views about why he's involved in climate and climate tech. They might be books, they might be experiences. We've had people talk about an art installation once. We had someone talk about Schopenhauer once as being like one of the reasons they're involved in climate. Don't ask me to explain it. I don't have that kind of time. But are there 3 things that you would be willing to share with listeners that have helped to shape your perspectives, that keep you going and motivated, that made you move in this direction?
So the first thing is that one of the things that motivate me that people think what I'm doing is crazy, and it's not possible to be involved in so many so many projects and everything. You say, okay, if you think it's crazy, I can do it. It's actually a challenge. For someone that worked before in the defense industry, and the defense industry is extremely important, I have the last 4 or 5 years when I'm working on climate, I feel much better that I'm doing something good that may help my kids and grandkids. And this feeling alone makes me want to push forward harder. It's enough. I'm proud from what I'm doing. My kids are proud in what I'm doing. My mother is absolutely sure I'm going to solve climate change. And when it's hot, she actually calls me and she asks me, Yehuda, say yes, everything is good. Say yes, everything is good. But it's so hot outside. So she's actually sure
Why
I'm
haven't you
solving
fixed
it
it
right
yet?
now.
Yeah,
Yes, I
Yehuda,
have
why
to
haven't you
fix it
fixed it yet?
now. So it's fun, it's like so I feel that I'm at the right place. The book that I recently read that I loved was from Bill Gates. Obviously I'm a fan, but what I saw in the book, it was really breakthrough energy. In Bill Gates has clarity about the problem, and you don't find it in all the places and with all the investors. They have clarity about the problem and they are learning. And I can see that over the years, how they change their mind about certain solutions. It's a living organization that improves all the time. And what I love there is the clarity in terms of what works and what doesn't work. Sometimes I also have different thoughts, but at least those can be arguments, but with a lot of clarity about what can work and what cannot. And I really recommend to read Bill's book because it gives you very good clarity about what can work in climate.
Well, that is super helpful. We'll be talking later on today, actually, to one of the officers at Clean Energy Ventures. So to give them their due, their props, another competitor breakthrough. So they're folks who, if they're not on their radar, they definitely should be. They're in some DAC stuff as well. So I can just say thank you at this point, Yehuda, for coming on and taking the time. Thanks for coming on Wicked Problems, man.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. And I'm sorry, I love to talk and I probably took more of your time than what you expected.
I would keep going for a couple more hours, man, if we had the time. But hopefully we get you back on, talk about climate crop, talk about some other things. Maybe we'll get you on as a regular. It's just great to talk. And again, we also promised we're not going to talk about anything else going on in the world, but obviously stay safe and best for you and your family.
Sounds great. And if you ever want me together with you to talk with Michael Bernard, just to an open conversation, I'm up to it.
I will certainly put that to Michael, and we'll see if he bites, and look forward to it. All right, Yehuda, all the best. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, And you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.